So this is the title of my thesis currently, Trauma as an Agent for Spiritual Formation and Growth. And what Walt is really encouraging me to do above all else is probably create a basically some training material, kind of like what I'm trying to do with you right here, right now, saying like, hey, to be able to provide youth workers or ministry workers with biblically based trauma care.
Mm.
So a couple like beginning parts, I think it's always good to start with like the convictions, and this is just project one of my entire thesis, but these are sort of the convictions that I think we all have to start with before we even talk about how we accurately do trauma care. And the first one is just providing a biblical definition of it. Like, right, trauma is one of those words where you say it, depending on who you say it to, it can either like totally repel them, like, oh, not everything is traumatic and trauma, big T, little T, all that stuff. But then you have it where you say trauma and people are like, everything is trauma, and my entire life and identity is based on it. And so there's obviously the way the world understands it, but then I think how the Bible understands it. And really what I have kind of come to, and what I'm going to be working with, is that ultimately what we're saying is trauma is the suffering effects felt and or caused by sin. Right? It can be both, it can be one or the other. But then, as much for everything I just said about everything is trauma and blah blah blah, the second conviction I work with is that ultimately all of creation is traumatized. One of the ways I've also potentially said it is, the biblical narrative tells us that all of creation has experienced and is still experiencing trauma. And really where this is the elevator pitch I give to people on this. Albert Einstein once was asked, how do you define evil? And this is a quote that he gave. He said, "Evil does not exist, sir, or at least it does not exist into itself. Evil is simply the absence of God. It's just like darkness and cold, a world that man has created to describe the absence of God. God did not create evil. Evil is not like faith or love that exists just as does light and heat. Evil is the result of what happens when man does not have God's love present in his heart. It's like the cold that comes when there is no heat, or the darkness that comes when there is no light."
Mm.
And so what the framework I try to work with when I try and talk to people is to say, all right, we can't understand the concept of cold without heat, can't understand the concept of good or evil without good. And if we as Christians think through this lens of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, really, fall, redemption, and restoration, they all have a foundation rooted in trauma. And so similarly, like how we can't understand cold without heat, what I've kind of am suggesting, it sounded like the basis of my entire thesis is that, we wouldn't even know what hope is without the existence of trauma. In creation, what would we have to hope for, right? And hope is, it's understood through the lens of trauma, and it's necessary because of that. And then this is another kind of just basic one. And did you watch that video that I sent you?
Mm-hmm.
So this language will make sense to you, right? It affects the whole person, spiritually, physically,
Yeah.
emotionally, all that. Fourth one is that, like, new life in Christ, it's only made possible through trauma. And that kind of sounds like a attention grabber, like headline, but that's why I said only Christ can restore trauma. And I think where we see this most happen throughout, like, scripture is, or just in our daily lives and just the life of the church, right? The message is death to self. That's how we find life. And the sacraments, they both point to that. It's death that brings life. Crucifixion and resurrection. You want to talk about the most traumatizing moment in all of history, but then yet the greatest life-giving moment in all of history. It's crucifixion, resurrection. And then you also have the teachings and examples of the early church and Paul. They rejoiced in suffering because it just meant that they were actually becoming more dependent on and becoming more like Jesus. And so really, Jesus is the key to all of this. And, it's really, once dying to self, that is a traumatic event in and of itself. That's what brings us life. And then the last one is that the biblical narrative provides a framework for understanding proper trauma care. And what I mean by this is the Bible ultimately promises us three things in the realm of trauma. First, trauma is going to happen, right? And I think what's important about this is it doesn't ignore it. It doesn't turn away from it, minimize, or erase it, right? Like, God recognizes this is happening. And I think that is such a key first step to say, like, no, this actually was a traumatic thing. And how does the biblical narrative inform the church on how we should notice and acknowledge trauma? I think Diane Langberg has a really helpful sort of category for this, the difference between justice and complicity, right? And so when we say trauma will happen, it's actually recognizing the trauma that's happened in someone's life. The Bible does that quite clear. But second, that there will be an intervention for trauma, right? God himself is going to confront it, intervene on behalf of the traumatized, and we see that throughout all of Scripture. And then the last thing I think truly, and this is the part where there's hope, is that I think that the Bible does promise like post-traumatic growth, but that happens only in Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit over a period of time, and ultimately to grow and edify the body of Christ. Right? And so that's and the other part here is, if and there's plenty of biblical examples of this, but if you actually look at people who have been traumatized in Scripture in their lives, there is this link between those who have been traumatized and then being sent out into mission. It's like after the trauma has been confronted and there's been growth, that's when we're now sent out for mission. So I think that's a really cool correlation and connection. So now we get to do right, applying these convictions to ministry practices. And I put this basic assumption down there, right? I started with, you are not a trained professional, but if you are, it works both ways. Let's recognize that we need to seek professional help if that's the appropriate thing, and we should consider that first, especially for people who have been through significant trauma. So with that in mind and that assumption, sort of how do we turn these convictions to ministry? I think the first and most important part is defining the current social reality, right? And there's two elements to that. There's of the individual that you're providing care to. One of my favorite quotes is, leaders define reality, right? Not what do we want it to be, what do we hope it would be, but just what are we dealing with? And I think this is where those adverse childhood experiences really, really help us understand the individuals that we're dealing with. You see up there in the top right, 4 or more of these, and those are all the consequences, right? I think there's like a 20-year life expectancy. Yeah, I think it's in the bottom left. So personally, why this really matters to me is I was 10 for 10 on the original ACEs as a kid. And so every single one of these things that they're talking about in terms of the long-term effects, I have suffered them, experienced them. I've gained 100 pounds, lost 100 pounds, have attempted suicide. I've had fatty liver before. All of these things have been something that has define my life in one way or another. And where that's really important is, you see in that triangle, there's a lot of, again, cognitive development, neurological development, social development, identity development that gets destroyed during that phase. And so just being able to say, okay, how traumatized of an individual are we dealing with here? It can really, really help. So defining that reality. But then the second one is defining the reality of the group or the community that individual is engaging or living in. And one way to help this, to think through this a little bit, is, have you ever heard of the scales of evangelism? It's an outreach model.
No, I haven't.
So it's this idea that, hey, if you're at a -5 and you're antagonistic to faith, say you're an atheist, there's also the other part, which is you're such a mature Christian that you're actually duplicating and creating more Christians through the discipleship process. Walt talked about this in one of our residencies. It's the ecological systems of development theory, right? Once you insert one thing into an environment, it's not that has been added, it's an entirely new environment. And so I think the problem, I love this idea and this scale for evangelism, but I think what we need to do is also have a trauma care scale, because speaking as one of these kids, I was one of these, the problem child, right? Now, when we go to, I'm going to go back a couple slides. If we look at this slide, we actually celebrate the antagonistic person becoming resistant. We celebrate that 1 degree of change. The problem comes is that for this problem child, we often want to get them as quickly to 3 as possible, not recognizing that, A, that's an exponential, impossible jump. But then the ecological systems of development thing, we have to recognize that problem child is in the same ecosystem as a Christian school kid. And when there's more on the positive side, what we do as youth workers, typically with behavior modification, is try and fix the problem child by fixing problems that don't need to be fixed. Because you want to talk about social maturity, social interaction, they don't recognize that they're being the problem child. And so by pointing it out, what you're inadvertently actually doing is sending them farther down that scale, to the point where they go, okay, I don't want anything to do with church. And that was my story. I got kicked out of multiple youth groups because I entered at a negative 8, 9, and they wanted me at a positive 2. And I didn't even have a reality to consider what positive 2 looked like in my life. For me, the first seeds of the gospel being planted into my life was seeing my uncle and aunt argue when I was 14 years old. I was actually eavesdropping, watching them. And at the end of the argument, there was no violence, there was no mean words. It was just intimacy and love. And I was like, what is this? Like, I've never seen this before. And so, like, we have to recognize, like, the group or community that they're in, they might be starting from a negative starting point, and it has nothing to do with their behavior. It has everything to do with kind of things that have happened to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, just really, I think defining the current social reality that we're living in, just knowing that right off the get-go gives you so much more patience with those problem children, because you recognize it's not that they're problem, they just need a lot of healing. And man, you want to talk about a fertile soil for the gospel to be rooted into, it's those kids. Where are there obvious signs of spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, or emotional trauma? And this is where I really think, and I can send you some of my lecture notes, but this is where understanding developmental theories is super helpful. Because for certain development stages, they need to know that there's a secure adult. And if they start acting out in a certain way, you kind of already have a clue there may not be a mature, stable adult in the house. Doesn't mean that they're hurting them, but it also doesn't mean their needs are being tended to. I think that the church is going to do itself a huge favor if it starts getting aware of the signs of physical trauma, or at least how spiritual, intellectual, relational, or emotional trauma manifests itself physically. As soon as I've started doing this work, it's been fascinating, because it's almost like a cheat code for pastoral care. I have story after story over the last year where I've met with people, and then within the first 30 seconds, I can clearly tell just by looking at their face, something's wrong. And it has nothing to do with me having a sixth sense. It's simply like, okay, your voice is now much more timid and quiet than it usually is. You're repeating yourself more often. Your eyes are sunken. You like weight gain, rapid weight gain. They're telltale physical signs. What I've been saying to people recently is trauma is almost a script. Like, you can tell very quickly, okay, this person's going through it, if you just do some of that basic awareness. So I think about, like, spiritual, right? Anytime you hear someone say, well, I don't know why God did this evil to me, that's a small symptom of, okay, we're not understanding the spiritual world here. Something happened that made you think God was the origin of this evil in your life. I already talked about some of the physical, but intellectual, people, one of the biggest places of intellectual trauma, people not being able to truly understand what's going on, is repeating the same questions over and over and over again, getting the same answers, but not ever being able to push through. Relational, I mean, those are some of the easiest ones to spot. Isolation, overly promiscuous behavior, especially relational kids who don't understand social cues, where it's obvious and it's like cringy. Those are the ones that you can spot out pretty quickly. And then emotional trauma is one of the quickest symptoms, is any heightened, or what I would say, what would be perceived as an exaggerated response to what otherwise would be a normal issue. Really intense reactions to what would otherwise be pretty normal circumstances, good sign of emotional. But there's tons of resources, and what I've even said to people is, you read this book, which hopefully you will at some point, or if you haven't already. She gives some, like I've said, I think chapter 6 is one of those chapters I would suggest people to read, because she just points out very quickly, hey, here's like the things that you can notice almost instantly someone's going through a hard time. So
Cool.
love this book, couldn't suggest it more. And then yeah, really, it's once you equip yourself with those things, how does this affect my approach?
At this point, if you want to go ahead and skip to 20:05, that's 20 minutes, 5 seconds, I'm going to have a personal conversation with Jess here, but you might actually tend to enjoy it. So if you want to skip ahead, go ahead. If not, you can listen in.
Is women who I know specifically have gone through any type of sexual assault or, sexual trauma. I go out of my way to make sure that the entire environment, that there's no funny sexual jokes from the guys. I'm very, very intentional with my body language, my posture. um I hope, hopefully this doesn't sound too inappropriate, and if it is, I welcome correction. But it changes from person to person. My coworker, well, my previous coworker who fled an abusive marriage before she started working for us, I couldn't ever hug her, even side hugs. And no matter how much affection we had towards one another in terms of like friends, she just always was like, she never said it, but you could just tell from those physical signs. She would, do this. She'd get, defensive. And so it's like, she never had to tell me, but just seeing it, I'm like, all right, this is going to change the way I approach her moving forward. I have another example, but were you going to say something?
Nope.
Okay. There's another young lady in our ministry. She has POTS and like 6 other horrific, like, uh chronic health issues. There has not been a single young adult event in the last 2 years that she's come to where she has not passed out for longer than 3 minutes. She's got a lot of trauma in her life. Her dad told her that she would be better off dead to him while she was with us because of the life insurance money he could collect off of it. Her mom died during COVID, right? And so she's a perfect case study of how trauma in her life set her on this physical deterioration path, that you lose hope and your physical body starts to break down. And we saw that with her. And so one of the things I do with her, knowing her relationship with her dad, is I spent a very considerable long amount of time building some trust and some boundaries, letting, like, basically communicating through my body language and my words, I don't want anything from you. I just want to serve you and love you. And it was about 6 months in, I ended up having to she had a plan to kill herself with meds. And so she called me to tell me, and I had to drive over to her house at 8:30. And ever since that event, I'd waited for an event like that. I actually, she's the only other woman that I actually say I love you to, but she knows what I mean, because she genuinely needs that love from a male in her life that wants nothing from her. And that relationship has been one of the most teachable relationships as it comes to trauma care, because um she thought that we were going to kick her out because of her passing out, and I was worried she was going to leave. So we've had really good conversations, and like, she's actually leaving now because she's going to go live with family. But like, one of the things I had said to her was like, whatever church you go to, and this is an inside joke with her, I said, just make sure that you find a pastor who will make sure there's a cookie in your hand when you wake up from passing out, because that's what we learned to do with her, so that she did not feel self-conscious. It's like, you know what, we literally have a roll of Oreo cookies at any event, just so that when Rachel passes out, we go and take the cookie and put it in her hand, so that when she wakes up,
It's so
huh?
yeah. This last year, I had a girl who was diagnosed with POTS too, and I had never heard of it before. And so
Yeah.
I'm like, everything you're saying, that's just so random. I had never, yeah, I didn't know anyone else who
Yeah,
had
but
POTS
just being a
before. But
stable
yeah.
presence, and just, finding those ways for people to, I didn't put this in here. It's just making sure people don't, it's balancing that fine line of recognizing that trauma is there, but not treating them as a broken person in the moment. They'll get to that point, like, one of the most healing moments of my life came in seminary when we had to do what was called a genogram. So we had to not only do a family tree, but like an emotional family tree, like what is all the weird, things. And I remember, my classmates, they had an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that had, 6 lines on it and carefully drawn. I had to get an 11 by 17, like, provide a legend, a key, and all that stuff. And one thing that I never forgot was when we got into prayer, I felt really guilt. I just felt a lot of shame, because it's like, this is my family, this is where I'm from. And I really got the sense that no one else was like me in that class. And one of the, gosh, I'm gonna cry just saying it. One of my classmates started his prayer by just saying, "Thank you for Eric's family, God. Like, thank you for the gift that they are. Thank you for all the good things." And it gets me to this day because I'm used to people apologizing for my family. I'm used to people grieving for my family. I'm used to people just saying all the negative things. And so even just making me feel like, okay, I'm not the weird one in the room, it's so life-giving. So
Mhm.
that's an aside.
Cool.
All right, back to this. Because now we're getting to the real practical. And then because this is the tool that I'm going to be using and hopefully equipping youth workers with or ministry workers with. So it's moving towards anti-fragility, post-traumatic growth together. You watch that video so you understand what anti-fragile means, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So, and the best way of understanding it is allowing honest reflection to live in harmony with challenging truths. And I'll show you exactly, literally show you exactly what I mean by that. So this is my trauma intervention tool that I've created from like all the research from the reading. So this is what this is. I'm going to take it through step by step. So basically from that Spire video, that's why I had people watch it before, just to have a foundational context, right? There's 5 things that we're talking about in trauma care. There's the spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional. There's 2 sort of tracks that we want to engage someone who's going through trauma with. This is what I like to call the reflection and fragile track, right? This is where, and this distinction is really important. Whenever we're in this track, we want to prioritize emotional honesty over accuracy and truth, right? So just let it out. And what I've told people often is think about it like a psalm of lament. The first half is them being like, God, you suck. Everything in my life is because you are the way you are. And then there's this calming down, and then there's this recognizing, okay, it's not God, it's other things at work, mainly me and my sin. And so there's this reflection and fragile track, but then we get this growth and anti-fragile track. And the questions here, what we want to do is prioritize accuracy and truth over emotional honesty. Okay, I know how you feel, and that's why we start that way. And that's where I said I'd bring it back. I actually started my first intervention, the first iteration of this was it's emotional was last. And what my father-in-law said was, he goes, I like how you go through all these questions. He goes, but if I'm being honest, if I have a traumatic situation come up in my life, I start with the emotional. He goes, it takes me a very long time to get to the spiritual. So even starting there, it's like, I got to work through some of these other things first. And I was like, bingo, totally right. And that's when it became a circle. So the questions that we ask someone, and I'll tell you how, like where this would be, like the specific example where this would be used. But the type of questions that we ask is in the emotional realm. How did I feel initially? And I'm going to use one example throughout throughout the rest of this to sort of illustrate what I mean. So I had this young man who was a high schooler when I was first starting here, and he had a very similar path to that young lady I talked with you about, in that he just was a problem child, 4 or 5 years out of high school, didn't want anything to do with God. He's now actually in ministry, and I meet with him once a month to sort of like be an outside of his own church mentor and just walk with him. And I took him through this one time and I just said, all right, man, like, how did you feel about it initially? And what I do is I wrote down everything that he said, like, just get it out. And he goes, I was pissed. I was this, I was that, I was confused. And what's really interesting is if you just let them share this emotional part, there are contradicting emotions every single time I've done it. And that's if you're able to pay attention and really catalog all the things that they're feeling, it's usually the emotional that will unlock something else. But that's what we start with. How did I feel about this? This is another really important second step. Who did I tell? And what I find more often than not is people who come to me and actually use this as an intervention tool haven't talked to anyone but me. And that in and of itself is, an area where it's like, okay, well, even in your honest reflection, we got to realize you got to talk about this. And if they've talked to a lot of people, I just say, okay, who's 3 people that you really care about their opinion, and what did they say? And one thing that I find common is that they all say the same thing. It's just they don't want to hear the advice. They don't want to hear the wisdom given. Third, what questions did I wrestle with? Right. And again, this is where honesty is over accuracy and truth. Just let them ask any dumb question that comes to mind. But like, for this individual that I brought up, he was frustrated, confused, and he felt shame. And the issue that he was dealing with was that he had been in sales for 3 years and he had been wanting this dream job, and it kept getting shut down to him. And so he said, you know what, finally, you know, God, I'm just going to give myself up to you. And that's when he started ministry. A week after he started his ministry job, he got his dream job offered to him. And he was like, why would God dangle this opportunity in front of me? Why would God let me get excited over something and then just entice me back to something? I was like, yeah, dude, that's a really good question, right? And for people who are offering the intervention, we're not trying to answer any questions for them in this process. It's just get it all out. Let's talk about it. Physical. How did my body react? And a lot of people, this is one that they don't think about hardly ever. You know, and this is where I say sometimes it's a script and sometimes you can see it very clearly. A lot of the young women, and it's not a sexist thing, it's a trauma thing. A lot of the young women who have just had really horrible breakups or who have just been abused in some way, shape, or form, you see them gain about 20 to 30 pounds in about 3 months. And a lot of the time, like, it's my thyroid, it's this, it's that, and sometimes that is true, but a lot of the times it's like, yeah, you also went through a really traumatic breakup and we got to deal with that. So how did my body react? What changes did I notice? It can be anything from small to big, right? And then this is the most important question because it's the question that gets asked the twice. What does God have to say about this? And this is where I say the be honest, not right part, because for this young man, where after we had talked through the emotional, the intellectual, and he had already been doing some reflection within himself, he was very honest with me and saying, you know what, man, Eric, I think what it is more than anything else is I feel like a phony. And I think God would say, I see right through you, man. That's why, like, I let you know, like, what it could look like, but I'm going to take you out of it because you're not ready and you're never going to be ready. I was like, all right, like I'm happy you said that to me. Right. And so this is where at that point, we go to the growth and anti-fragile track where we do honor accuracy and truth over emotional honesty. And the questions that we ask here, and I'm going to come back to this one, but what does God have to say about this? And I'll talk about the importance of that in a bit. Physically, how does my body need to express my emotions? And this is where it's also freedom to express, you know, emotional honesty, but at the same time, it's also an accountability. I used to weigh 320 pounds. A lot of that was due to the trauma of my wife experiencing 3 miscarriages and 5 years of infertility. And what I needed was for someone to say, your body needs to get moving. You need to be active. And again, it's not, it may have hurt. It may have been a challenging truth, but it's like, there was, you know, the way I eat just, and for me, when I get stressful, I get angry. And so it's like, my wife was like, let's get you a heavy bag so that, you know, when your body needs to physically express emotions, you don't have to destroy anything and you can just actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Do you need to scream? Do you need to dance? You know, I tell people they found that dancing is ultimately it's your brain's way of responding to too much stimulus. Like, it doesn't even know what to do, and so it just has to move. It has to get going, and so it's where does your body need to move? Does it need to contract? Just how do you need to physically respond to this? Intellectually, and the question here is really important because when we talk about accuracy and truth over emotional honesty, this is the hardest part for me that I found because you need to push people to ask actual intellectual questions. And why I chose this one is because it's a contradiction in and of itself. And that's sort of like the example I want to give. Why would a good God allow this? Even in that question, you're questioning the character of God, right? And so but you're also saying why would you? So why did God kill my grandma with cancer is not a good intellectual question. And so that's the area for us where we go, let's think about this for a second. Then you move on to relational. What does my brother and sister in Christ have to say about this? Oftentimes what I find is you're either going to have the same people that they told in the first track, but if it's not, and they say, oh, well, my Christian friends, it is fascinating to see the distinction in or the difference in answers. Oh, okay, well, all my friends were saying this, but yeah, my church is saying this, and they all said the same thing. And so even them having to wrestle with that in that moment. And then this is the last question, and it's honestly, it's the most important because it determines the rest of how you move forward. Does God honor my current emotions? Not how should I feel, not how does God want me to feel. It's right now how I feel. Can God honor my current emotions? And I'll talk about sort of how we kind of think through that a little bit. But those are the questions. And so this is how the path starts, right? So you begin here. What do I mean by beginning here, right? We want to define a traumatic event. So this is all assuming that there's someone in your ministry who has come to you and who has said, I need help growing through this, right? So what we want to do is we want to find a beginning point. And so if we look at the clinical definition of trauma, right, it's trauma is a person's emotional response. Even just knowing that right there is such a key, because a lot of people think that trauma means an event. No, it's your emotional response to an event. So it could be something really small, but the degree of your response determines the degree of the trauma that you're facing, right? And so it tends to be sudden and unpredictable, feels beyond a person's control. Most important events are traumatic to the degree that they undermine a person's sense of safety in the world and creates a sense that catastrophe could strike at any time. And so, as silly as it may sound, the person, my dad was murdered. I know that there are high school students that feel the same, if not commensurate amount of grief when their girlfriend breaks up with them because of the life that they've lived. They haven't had these adverse childhood experiences. It's been good, but that is the event that makes them feel like they have lost control over their world. So it's that emotional response. And I think that is the most important thing for us as youth workers and just ministry workers to be like, hey, we're not trying to categorize how bad of an event it was. It's how did the person respond to it? And these are the types of trauma, right? You've got the emotional types of trauma, just a mental response to a disturbing event. There's acute, which would be, kind of like the trauma I experienced with my dad. It's just this really intense emotional trauma after an event, death of someone. There's chronic, long-term response, people who've been diseased, people who, have to be caretakers if their spouse has Alzheimer's for, a couple of years. It breaks you down. Complex trauma, I would call this the summer of 2020, when there was COVID, when there was racial division with George Floyd, and the election stuff happening all at the exact same time. They might be related, right? We might be able to make a connection, but they're also not related in our head. And it's just like, what is going on? I don't even know how to make sense of the world I'm living in. There's also physical trauma, right? You get in an accident, but then there's also this secondary and vicarious. And this is where youth workers and ministry workers themselves have to check their own heart, because this is, repeated exposure to the suffering of others. And this is where I think Diane Langberg gives the most helpful advice for ministry workers on how to move forward, because man, it's hard for us to go into others' darkness, and we're not Jesus, and we can get stung by that darkness and we can get infected by it. Only he's able to really take someone out of it. And so we experience a lot of this, but yeah, first responders, but it's seeing too much suffering happen with other people. A lot in refugee camps, people experience that as well. I've already talked to you about like my biblical definition of trauma, right? The suffering effects felt and are caused by sin. And so trying to find a beginning point, what I ask people, even if they feel like they haven't, been traumatized per se. All right, here's some questions I want you to think through. What was a moment in this entire, journey that just made you feel unsafe or unstable, right? You're losing control. You just don't know you just don't know. Where have you sensed impending catastrophe in your life? Right. And that can be a lot of times with relationships, with jobs, health. My wife had cancer when she was 18, and I can sense when she's getting a little anxious about, blood results and stuff like that, because there's just this impending catastrophe that she feels like might come upon her at any moment. But then also what's out of your control that threatens you, right? Because there's so many things outside of our control that we can just put blinders on, but what is the thing outside of your control that's making you feel this sense of emotional response that's harmful to you? There's a lot of other questions. I'm sure I'll provide tons more as this progresses, but that's sort of the questions I've been dealing with in real time. So, any questions from you?
No, this is really good. Like, I want to really encourage you of like, this is really helpful material.
That just made
So
my
be
heart so
encouraged.
all right, so this is the actual, so I just told you what the questions were, right? This is what the actual sitting down with someone looks like, the actual process. You find that beginning point, and you start by just reading Psalm 46:10 together. Be still and know that I am God. Take some time to just pause. When I do this with people, I say, let's take 3 deep breaths in and just, As you're breathing in, be still and know. And then as you let go, even in your head, that I am God, just that refrain, right? Just try and center ourselves there. Once we do that, let's go through those questions. And you, as the person who's providing the intervention, again, I would take very detailed notes if they're comfortable with it, just so you can reference back to some of it. I think it's really, really helpful. And then this is that part where I said I wanted to come back to. This is the turning point. I want to go back to that young man that I was talking with. He said, I feel shame because I feel like God sees right through me and I'm not qualified for ministry, and he's trying to let me know that. I said, all right, I appreciate that. I hear that. I've felt that too, more than you possibly know. I said, so now, what does God have to say about this? Now what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that Jesus is right across the room from you in a chair. He's looking right at you, and he heard everything that you just had to say. And rather than emotionally responding, who do you know Jesus Christ to be as the Bible reveals him to be? What is his character as God's word shares it? And what would he actually say to you, to challenge you, to grow you? And he just broke down. He said, he goes, I think what he would say is, I can use you exactly where you're at. And that's how I usually use people. It's like, bingo, man. Like that's, and he goes, oh, and he just felt this relief of like, yeah. And that's where I got to share, like, dude, this is all the ways I'm messed up. Here's all the things I struggle with. Like, got it. And then you get to, and if they do get that, you're then able to root that in some of the biblical narrative. Like, dude, look at Abraham. He pimped his wife out twice, like David killed a guy. Like if you, and it just being able to then, it gives you an opportunity to then maybe tell the story of scripture where they can find their story in it. Right. And so just, hey, what does God really have to say about this? And then going through all those questions. What I have found is if you're able to have a breakthrough in that turn, it usually unlocks the rest of the questions moving forward. If you're able to have a breakthrough right there, typically that's where when we get to this part right here at the end, it's usually a yes. But I'll have some. So at this point, right, this is the it's time to decide moment. This is where we want accuracy and truth and emotional honesty. Right? It's they can contradict each other, but we have to identify both. Does God honor my current emotions? If the answer is no, that's okay. All we do then is, and you can start to see where the lines are and everything. This is strictly just for like if I ever have to publish this, so I can say figure 1A, right? These are sort of like the off ramps or on and off ramps because maybe we worked through the relational piece. I don't think God can honor where I'm at right now, but I know I'm fine from the physical standpoint. So I don't need to go back and talk about that. But what I encourage people to do is, okay, then let's do this process again. That repetition that I was talking about, right? Like let's do this again and let's see where we might get stuck. And if the answer is no, right? So you do the same thing off on ramp all the way until you get back to this question again, right? And this is where I would say this is some suggestions for further reflection and follow-up to figure out if you do get stuck or if someone gets stuck, what are some of the things that might help you get them unstuck? And what I've found from experience is these are a couple things. If you actually take this wheel and you imagine that it's a concealed water wheel, right, where these divides sort of act as water dams, it really helps us answer some really important questions. So imagine this thing is spinning, spinning, spinning. If they are stuck and they can't necessarily communicate why, one of the questions I like to ask is, all right, is there a hole in one of these chambers that is letting some of the water out? Because if water comes out of one of those chambers and it's dammed, the equilibrium is just going to all of a sudden get thrown off the wheel and it's going to be destroyed. So is there an area that needs some patching? Another really important question, imagine those dams are open and the wheel is spinning. Is there one of these chambers that has been infected and is beginning to pollute the others? Right. And so if we use the dam analogy, like say, it's yeah, you know what? I've had some really, really bad friends and influences in my life, and it has begun to affect the way I feel emotionally. I feel, that I think about God. That's where we say, okay, then maybe what we need to do is shut the dams on the relational thing, do some detox there, really work on that, and then, slowly but surely open it back up. And then the last one, and I'll just speak from a personal perspective, because this is not just something I encourage others to do. I do this myself when I'm going through difficult times. And I've taken myself through this wheel multiple times, and what I have found is, if you were to throw a high powered magnet into the middle of it, which chamber would it fix to first? And what I mean by that is I was going through a really difficult time about 6, 7 months ago, and I just like, okay, God, I'm gonna do this with myself, and immediately spiritual. It was like, boom, like you have unconfessed sin in this area of your life. And I knew it right away. Like, okay, I know it's this, I just don't want to acknowledge it and I don't want to let it go. But like for other people, it could be relational. It's like, no, it doesn't matter how strong I am, it doesn't matter how smart I am, my dad is always going to beat me. My mom's always going to call me fat. It's like there are some magnets where it's like that's got a strong pull and we can't discount that. So those are some questions I've found really help sort of get unstuck. But if we end up getting to this point where we can finally say yes, then I say, all right, let's do it again. Be still, know that I am God. Can you accept that? In light of your circumstances, can you accept that God knows how you feel, you know where you need to grow, and we can move forward? And if it's still no, all right, then we'll be patient. Let's do the whole thing over again. But if it's a yes, I have found, so if you watch that video at the very end, he talked about how ultimately what we want to do is cultivate gratitude.
Mhm.
I have found that this is the most healing part of the entire process if we get here, offering a prayer of gratitude. And if you're able to do it for them, offer up on their behalf, I have yet to end a meeting where there has not been tears, because there's a sense of which the fact that we can even get to a spot of gratitude with where we started, it's humbling. And then I think what's really cool is we say the Lord's Prayer together. And when you read the Lord's Prayer together after a time like this with someone, what you really become aware of is how simple it is,
Mm.
how complicated we have made everything else. And just to say, he's just saying, hey, I just need to eat today. I need to, need to stay away from sin and forgive other people and just hope that Jesus comes back soon. It's like, man, and in that perspective, the things I'm going through, they hurt, but they're not going to destroy me. God's got this. And so yeah, this is what the wheel looks like. I'll gladly send you the actual I'll send you this entire PowerPoint, I don't know, or this entire keynote, and some of my other stuff. But yeah, that is what my life's work has been the last 2 years. And so yeah, I would love to hear any feedback you got.
Yeah, I want to encourage you. I like this is really good work. And like that wheel's genius. Like I think that's such a helpful tool for myself as I'm going to be walking with clients. But I think the biggest thing is I've been thinking about like how to equip other people to do it who don't have like it's not their job to be thinking about trauma informed care and counseling and coaching people. And so just trying to think of like tangible resources for them, like so good. What does it look like to help people walk through like the whole like victim mindset of just like it can be so like narcissistic or just like very like self-centered view of like all is wrong. And because sometimes people get really stuck in that and just can't, especially if they don't have a faith background or if they're not walking with the Lord or spiritual in any way. Like it just is really challenging.
That's actually a really good question, and I just haven't communicated it well. But this is one thing that I should put in here. This one of the other basic assumptions going through this is that someone wants growth.
Hmm.
And that's where I say, like, I make it very clear right from the beginning. I'm gonna let you say everything that you need to say, and I'm gonna let you get it off, and I'm not gonna editorialize, I'm not gonna judge, I'm not gonna say right or wrong. But I am gonna get to a point where I'm gonna challenge you in what you feel. And so if challenge is not what you want, if growth is not what you want, I can be a listening ear, but just recognize before we start this, I'm gonna push you in some ways that might make you feel
Yeah.
uncomfortable. Is that something that we can do? And I've done that with some people. I've had one person turn me down, like, what, I'm just not ready. I'm like, okay, that's fine. In a way, that in itself is providing good biblically based trauma care. I don't need to say anything if you don't want it. But then the other part of it is what I've found is if you starting with that honest track, they usually feel heard, like really, really heard. If you can just not answer any questions and just listen, they get to a point where it's kind of like that human phenomena when you say something out loud and you're like, oh, I didn't even realize how ridiculous that sounded until I actually said it out loud. I've been living in my own head. I've had so many people say something and just go, oh, I can't believe I just said that. But in their head, that's only where they've been living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will share with you in that blog, there is a quote from Diane Langberg from her Suffering in the Heart of God that I think man, it hits me. Actually, not. I'm just going to pull it up right now because I think that you will very much appreciate hearing this anyway. So she talks about people that she was working with in traumatic situations, and so she writes, come on, our task is no less than living out before them the character of God himself. Early in my work with survivors, I longed for a woman who had been chronically abused to truly know the love of God. I tried telling her about it, but realized that she was only politely listening. I clearly remember getting down on my knees before God and begging him to help her see what she so desperately needed to see, that he loved her. What I heard back from God was, you want her to know how much I love her? Then you go love her in a way that demonstrates that. You want her to know that I'm trustworthy and safe? Then you go be trustworthy and safe. Demonstrate in the flesh the character of God over time so that who you are reveals God to the survivor. If you want the survivor, or in our case, skeptics, non-believers, to understand that God is a refuge, then be one for her. If you want her to grasp the faithfulness of God, then be faithful to her. If you want her to understand the truthfulness of God, never lie to her. If you want her to understand the infinite patience of God, be patient with her. And when you are not a refuge, or are tired of being faithful, or are fudging in your answers, or growing impatient with the necessary repetition, then get down on your knees and ask God to give you more of himself so that you might represent him well. Here's my encouragement for you, and then I got to let you go if that's all right.
Yeah, totally.
In that book, Diane Langberg, I know you're going to be walking with a lot of people who need a lot of love, a lot of care, and a lot of grace, especially with safe families. I've been there. It can drain you. One of the best quotes from that book from Diane Langberg that has stuck with me ever since, and it's honestly changed the way I do pastoral care. It's changed my relationship with God, which is, if you look at the story with Jesus and Lazarus, we have the perfect theological backing for how we are supposed to understand our relationship to helping suffering people. First and foremost, recognize God delayed. So God's in charge. He's got his own way of doing things. Second, Jesus cried, knowing he was going to resurrect him. Knowing the end result, Jesus still wept for him. He goes, but the part that we are afraid of and entering into people's suffering so often is that we are not going to be able to fix it. We're not going to be able to make it better. We're not going to see any growth. And what she says is, remember, all you're called to do is roll stones and unwrap bandages. When we see God resurrect Lazarus, there are people there, and he calls people to play their part, but he does the resurrecting, right? He does all the resurrecting. All he says is, hey, move that stone, remove that, and then watch me go to work. If we can see that our work is to remove bandages and move stones, it takes so much pressure and so much responsibility off fixing a broken person. You can't. Only God can. And so if you can just be faithful and listening to him in those small steps, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a good word. Thanks so much, Eric. I really appreciate it. I will be passing on this. Yeah, if you can send me all the graph and then the slides, that'd be awesome.
I will. So thank you so much. God bless.
Yeah, you too. Bye.